Hello everyone, welcome to our Becoming Your Mom support group. We have some visitors with us today. Welcome to you. My name is Mark and I'm the group leader. And I think we'll start by reciting our mission statement. We love our moms, but we are not our moms.
We love our moms, but we are not our moms.
Carol, would you mind starting us off this week?
Hi everyone, I'm Carol.
Hi Carol.
I'm the oldest of 3 roommates and I'm turning into my mom. I clean up everything after them. I've even started doing their laundry.
I talk to myself in the grocery store all the time.
All of my status updates are just pictures of kids. I don't even have kids.
Same. Well, kids and recipes.
The other day, I almost licked my finger and wiped the face of a total stranger.
I keep saying words like garbage and target. What is that?
I'll send a text to someone just to let them know I sent them an email.
Well, how else would they know?
Right?
I mean, these shoes were on sale. What am I supposed to do? Not buy them?
I call my husband my son's name, and sometimes I call my son the dog's name.
I always tell people, I'll be like 2 minutes, then it'll be like an hour.
Whoa, take it easy there. Shannon already has a tissue. We really don't need to offer her one.
I do.
Did you see how they let the momness overtake them? So you may not be able to avoid becoming your mom, but the key is to let the beautiful things about moms shine through in your life. The kindness, the caring, the compassion, the qualities that God gave moms when He created them.
Oh, like when I text my friends, LOL, lots of love.
That's not what LOL means.
That's what my son told me it meant.
LOL, lots of love. What else would it mean?
You know, I used to be an amazing dancer. Now when I dance, people just get embarrassed. Can I show you?
No, Carol. Carol, sit down. It's not bad. Carol, please. 1, 2.
Are we good with the camera? All right. We're going to do something that I have not done in a long time, and that is kind of give a Mother's Day sermon. Typically, for Mother's Day, we're in the middle of a book of the Bible, and so that would always keep me from preaching a message about Mother's Day. But this year, it worked out where I was able to, as a part of our series titled Life Lessons, we could focus in on a story about a mother and her son from the Bible. So we're going to look to the example of Hannah from the Old Testament. Something that I found interesting about Hannah and her husband in the Bible. Back a couple of months ago, Nicole and I, we were preparing a number of messages for a marriage retreat that we were teaching at. And I was working on doing a session based off of strong marriages in the Bible. And one of the examples that kept coming up as a good example of a godly marriage was Hannah and Elkanah. And as you read, I'm going to ask you to see if you agree with maybe my assessment of their marriage. So if you have your Bibles, please turn in them to 1 Samuel chapter 1. We're going to read through the entire first chapter. And as we read, remember that what we are doing in this series is looking at one person from the Bible to see how his or her life would be an example to us and how they had a particular characteristic about them that we would be able to learn from them also. For Hannah, what we will find is that it takes great faith to release back to God that which He has given us. So, 1 Samuel 1, please. There was a man from Ramathaim Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. I will point out, let's keep going on before I talk about that. Verse 2. He had 2 wives. Okay, that's the part where when I was preparing, okay, what are the godly examples of marriage in the Bible, I came across, if the first thing that describes you as a husband is he had 2 wives, that probably eliminates you from being a godly example of a husband. The polygamy, though it unfortunately is becoming more and more popular, and it will be a greater threat to marriages in the godly marriages in the future, though it was way too accepted in the Bible, that does not mean that it's okay by God's standards. Though a lot of the guys in the Bible had multiple wives, that doesn't mean that they were honoring God by having multiple wives. So, though there are a lot of ways in which Elkanah loved his wife Hannah, and there clearly are examples of it, and he did this in a fashion that was godly, let's not define their marriage as a godly one. Verse 2. He had 2 wives, the first named Hannah, and the second Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. Now this possibly explains why Elkanah had 2 wives. Maybe what happened here is that first he married Hannah, and that's why she's listed first as his wife. But then once it was discovered that they conceive a baby, as a way to continue his lineage and his name, Elkanah took on a second wife in order to have children with her. Now, obviously, this sounds creepy to us today, and it should. And I'm not merely trying to, excuse his behavior or anything like that. I'm just trying to point out why it was likely that he turned to a second wife. To be barren in their culture was seen as a curse. It wasn't a good thing for a husband or a wife to not have children. Without children, there would be no help from them with the house. There would be no one who would care for the elderly spouses. This is long before Social Security or retirement or anything like that. Most importantly, to the Jewish mind back then, if God is going to send his Messiah to one couple, and if they have no children, then that automatically removes them from the possibility of being the ones who God would bring the Messiah into the world through. So having children really was a big deal for them. Verse 3. This man would go up from his town every year to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of armies at Shiloh, where Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were the Lord's priests. Okay, so very quickly, Shiloh. Shiloh is a town that is not mentioned that often as we read through the Bible. Here is a map of ancient Israel at the time. So where we're at is right around the time of the Judges. It's a little bit after the time of the Judges. And what had happened was when the Israelites came into the Promised Land and first settled the land, Jerusalem, which is right around in here, wasn't much of a town. In fact, at the time it was called Salem. And there wasn't a whole lot going on there until David. So what they did is, where's Shiloh at? It's up here. So when they first settled the Holy Land, they put the capital city in Shiloh way up here. Again, here's Jerusalem to give you a picture. Shiloh is way up there. This was, and what they then, the reason it was the capital is that Joshua brought the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle into Shiloh, and that's where they set it up. And so during the time of the Judges, Shiloh, for the most part, was viewed as the capital city of Israel. Verse 4. Whenever Elkanah offered a sacrifice, he always gave portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to each of her sons and daughters. But he gave a double portion to Hannah, for he loved her even though the Lord had kept her from conceiving. So we read here that it was God who kept her from having children. And so this serves as a good time to address what I know that for many can be a difficult thing to think about today. What do we say? What do we do with these women who are either unable to have children, have decided not to have children, are single and without children, or those who have lost a child? I know that Mother's Day can be a difficult thing for many in our church because it serves as a reminder of what could have been, what never will be, or what has been lost. And even for those who have come to terms with either being a mother or not, this day can still be difficult because it maybe reminds us of our own mothers. And how many here would love to have just one more conversation with her? Would love to spend just another moment in her kitchen learning that dish that you always meant to learn because she cooked it just out of memory, but you never thought to take that time to learn how to duplicate it. Or you would just be so happy to see her once more and know that everything is okay. Mother's Day, Father's Day can be difficult for many in our church for a number of different reasons. And so please know that when we honor our mothers, we do so recognizing that not everyone had a mother who maybe was worthy of being honored. We know that it can be painful for this day to serve as a reminder of what has happened or hasn't happened. And so know that while we celebrate mothers, we do not forget anyone in this space in our church today. Your pain, your loss, your experience with your mother as a mother, or your desire to be a mother helped shape you into the woman of God that you are right now. And God is pleased with who you are right now as a mother, as a woman, if you are walking in His ways. So please know that, again, that while we certainly honor our mothers, and we do have gifts for our mothers, for our ladies, when you leave here, please know that you're not forgotten if you are not a mother right now. You are loved. You are loved by God. You are loved by your church. And you are not forgotten in that. Verse 6. Her rival would taunt her severely just to provoke her, because the Lord had kept Hannah from conceiving. Year after year, when she went up to the Lord's house, her rival taunted her in this way. Hannah would weep and would not eat, year after year. Like, listen, just feel the weight of that. So often people have this goofy, misguided idea that everyone in the Bible has it all together, that we could never find ourselves within the pages of Scripture. Understand, the point of the Bible is not to find ourselves, it is to point to Christ. But I have a feeling that far too many men and women can relate to Hannah in this story. Whether it is from a person in your life or life itself who seemed to be mocking you. Have you ever been so overwhelmed by a situation that you would go before God to weep and you couldn't even bring yourself to eat? Please know that when life or a person hits you in this way, when it hits you that hard, God hears your prayer. Now, it might not be answered right away, and it might take some fighting and some struggle. It might require you to have to give up even more of your life to Christ. It might even take you finally being honest with who you are, with what is happening, or escaping the situation that you are in, working even harder, speaking with someone about it. I don't think that God will usually just snap a finger and get you out of a trying time in your life just because He loves you too much, to simply put a Band-Aid on you and not allow the furnace of our struggles to refine us more into the man or the woman that God would have us be. You see, when we are facing these struggles, we're year after year, again, hear that part of the scripture, year after year she was dealing with this. There is something that God is going to show you through it. There is something that He will teach you through your pain, and it might not be something that you want to learn, but know that when you cry out to God in those times, He hears and He answers. Verse 8. Hannah, why are you crying? Her husband Elkanah would ask. Holy typical man, right? Like year after year, and Elkanah's like, what? What happened? Why are you crying? Why won't you eat? Why are you troubled? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Now, to be fair to Elkanah, I think he was genuine in this. Like, it's, I'm here. I can certainly relate to a guy saying something like that, not trying to diminish her pain, but just to say, God has given you something. Verse 9. On one occasion, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh. The priest Eli was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple, deeply hurt. Hannah prayed. Now remember, they were at worship, they were sacrificing, they were in church. And she was deeply hurt while being in worship of God. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. Some people might read this and think that she is bargaining with God. Maybe she was to a certain extent, but it was more than just bargaining. She was vocalizing that point in her life where God calls all of us to. All that He has given us, He calls us to give back to Him, because in His hands, that which we hold on to will be much more effective. We'll talk about that a little more in a bit. But very quickly, just so that we are all on the same page here, verse 11. Hannah says that his hair would never be cut. She wasn't saying this because she wanted her son to be a rock star, or the first Fabio, showing my age there. This was her way of saying that her son would take the Nazirite vow. A Nazirite, not to be confused with a person who comes from Nazareth. A lot of people confuse this. Jesus was not a Nazirite. He came from Nazareth. A Nazirite was a person who for a certain amount of time would devote themselves to serving God in some way and being separate from those around them. And they would do this by taking on these different vows. They would vow to abstain from fermented drink. And just in case something they were drinking, like a juice, if you remember one of the first communions that we had back from COVID, I had just finished saying, like, it was the little, like the snack cups of juice and the wafer, and I'm like, yeah, this stuff lasts forever. When we took a sip of that, it was starting to ferment. It was a little funky. In order to protect themselves from that type of situation, they weren't allowed to drink anything from the vine. So whether it was juice or fermented, they couldn't go near it. They were not allowed to go near a dead body. That's kind of random, like, okay, we can live with that one. And then the other thing is they were not allowed to cut their hair. So Hannah was saying this son of hers that she had hoped for, that she went to God crying over, would be one who would serve God and would be holy, would be set apart from everyone else. Verse 12, please. While she continued praying in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, and though her lips were moving, her voice could not be heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, "How long are you going to be drunk? Get rid of your wine." So understand a couple of things here. Silent reading, I know we're talking about silent prayer with Hannah, but silent reading did not become popular until the Middle Ages. And it wasn't until the 1800s where it became the norm. Like, the way that we read isn't what most of human history has been. It's only been about 200 years where people would silently read. Before that, everybody would be on their phones and just reading out loud, the stuff that they are reading. It's not like how it is today. So for Hannah's story here, we're talking about an era of around 1100 BC, 3,000 years ago. In this culture, it was normal to pray out loud and to read audibly. Think of the time in the book of Acts when they heard what the one man was reading, how he was reading from Isaiah. Us today, the only way we would know someone is reading their Bible is if we happen to see a book that looks like a Bible. But it was the norm to read it out loud. You didn't keep it to yourself, your prayers either. And so Eli, to see Hannah standing there and just moving her lips, he thought it was strange, and so he assumed that she must be drunk. But she wasn't drunk. She was at the end of her rope. She was heartbroken. How often have people confused our last straw kind of moment with something else? Hannah is at a point of surrender to God here. This is a beautiful thing, even in the midst of her personal tragedy and longing. And then comes along this guy who totally gets it wrong, doesn't see what God is doing in her life. Was Eli, being, mean or judgmental or quick to speak? Probably. But I want us to focus on Hannah here, not what Eli did. Hannah did not allow anyone to knock her off track on the journey that God had placed her on. Could have she just blamed Eli for being kind of a putz here? Yes. She could have left that place and said, "You know what, I tried the whole God thing, and where did it get me? Year after year I would go to worship, and my rival would make fun of me the entire time. And then I finally turn to God and I'm praying to him, and the priest comes up to me and he's like, 'Hey, you're drunk. What are you doing? Get off your wine.'" Like, it got me, this guy has got to be so out of touch, and God must be so out of touch with what is happening in my life. And so I'm at the end of my rope, and then God sends his person to come and beat me down even more. And unfortunately, that happens even today, and it happens here from time to time. And when that happens, when someone says something while not really understanding what all is happening, when someone says something that shows their lack of insight, don't allow that to be a deal breaker. Do not allow the enemy the victory. Stay focused, as Hannah did, on her relationship with God. Show grace even when those around you are showing ignorance. And continue to walk with God. Do not get sidetracked. Do not allow their issues to sway you from what is going on in life. Even in your hurt, even with your loss and your pain, show Christ back to them. Hannah does this by explaining the situation so that Eli does finally get it. Verse 15. "No, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman with a broken heart. I haven't had any wine or beer. I've been pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment." Eli responded, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the request you've made of him." "May your servant find favor with you," she replied. Then Hannah went on her way. She ate and no longer looked despondent. Hope can make such a difference in life, can it not? Hannah was at her end. She says it right here. She was in such anguish and felt so much resentment, and what she needed to hear was a reminder, was a word of hope spoken by someone who in reality was not speaking the words of man, but was speaking the word of God into her life. Church, there are people sitting next to you that are dealing with some heavy things in life. Even if they are things that we all deal with, for some, when they first deal with it, it's a big deal. Whether someone is dealing with being a parent for the first time, or wondering if they are going to be single forever going forward, contemplating retirement, something as silly as officially becoming old in a couple of weeks. People are dealing with things in life, and what they need is someone who can speak God's word to them to bring them hope, to remind them of God's love in their life, to help bring some kind of perspective on what really matters in life. So Christians, are we speaking that word, those words of hope into people's lives around us? Are you spreading the good news of what God has done to be an encouragement to those who are around you? And so very often when someone shares that word of hope with us, it doesn't have to be in this dramatic way where there's this theatrical score playing in the background. It is often in very simple ways, through a conversation while walking, drinking some coffee while working together on something. I once needed to hear some words of hope while I was dealing with those first few months of being a father of 3, all of which were 6 years and under. It was the first time that I dealt with the heaviness or the stress of thinking about the future for my children. What I'm trying to say is that I was dealing with worry and doubt for the very first time in my life. And it was all because of my kids. It was their fault. And it wasn't because of anything they were doing. It was all me. It was me being concerned for them, watching out for them, wanting to give them as good a life as I could give them. And it was causing so much worry in my life. I was working at a church at the time, and the pastor and I would often have lunch together. And while eating, I shared how I wished someone would have warned me that worry or concern for my children would become a part of my life. And this pastor then said something that has stayed with me ever since. He told me, the worry doesn't go away. In fact, it gets worse as they get older. What changes is your faith in God, and that He was always the one leading them, and their lives are always in their hand, are in His hands. So we'll talk a little more about that in a bit. And it was only a few years after he had shared that with me that he had to watch his own adult daughter pass away from a prolonged illness. And still today, he continues to serve God in ministry. But his words to me, they helped bring me hope and a more resolute faith that God hears my prayers, that He knows my thoughts before I vocalize them, and that He is far more trustworthy with that which means so much to me. And so I was able in that moment to understand, okay, yes, my children are God's anyways. I said that, I knew that then, and it's been tested time and time and time again. But I've been able to see how faithful God has been. And so what's changed isn't, again, that the worry is gone. It's that God has proven Himself time and time again. And in Him I trust. Verse 19. The next morning, Elkanah and Hannah got up early to worship before the Lord. Afterward, they returned home to Ramah. Then Elkanah was intimate with his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. My kids are in the room. I had all kinds of things I was going to say about those couple verses, but I'm not going to go there for their... Okay, so, but guys, if you want some advice, just come speak with me afterwards. I can share some things with you. Verse 20. After some time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel because she said, I requested him from the Lord. When Elkanah and all his household went up to make the annual sacrifice and his vow offering to the Lord, Hannah did not go, and explained to her husband, after the child is weaned, I'll take him to appear in the Lord's presence and to stay there permanently. Her husband Elkanah replied, do what you think is best, and stay here until you've weaned him. May the Lord confirm your word. So Hannah stayed there and nursed her son until she weaned him. When she had weaned him, she took him with her to Shiloh, as well as a 3-year-old bull, half a bushel of flour, and a clay jar of wine. Though the boy was still young, she took him to the Lord's house at Shiloh. In most cultures where clean water is not a promise, it is typical for a child to be breastfed until 3 years or older. So Hannah gives birth to her son, who was this answer to her prayers, which came from a place of such hurt and pain. And when the time was right, she then fulfills her promise to God to give that back to him, which he gave her. Verse 25. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. Please, my Lord, she said, as surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this boy. And since the Lord gave me what I asked him for, I now give the boy to the Lord. For as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. Then he worshiped the Lord there. I would encourage any parent, memorize 1 Samuel 1:28. I now give the child to the Lord. For as long as he or she lives, she or he is given to the Lord. Then they worship the Lord there. In the next chapter, Hannah goes on to sing a song that in many ways was a precursor to Mary's song in the Gospel of Luke. And then as life went on, Samuel went on to be a significant prophet in the history of Israel, especially in the beginning stages of the aristocracy in Israel. So what about Hannah's life is something that we should seek to see evidence of in our own lives? Very quickly, I see 3 ways that we can apply these verses, Hannah's example, to our lives. The first one is Hannah's example is one of seeing these deep hurts of her life become something that would be a blessing to many, many others. Hannah wanted to be a mother, and she was ridiculed by her rival because of her great desire was left unmet. And so in her anguish, she cries out to God, and he answers her by giving her Samuel, a son who would go on to become one of the greatest prophets of Israel. His ministry became a blessing to many people. He served as one of the final judges. He was a priest. He warned the nation of Israel of their desire to have a king, thus serving as a national prophet. He was a military general at one point, leading in these different campaigns against their enemies, and he was used by God to bring about the greatest king of Israel, David. I have to imagine that Hannah, as the mother of Samuel, was able to look on for a while and be amazed at how the very thing that caused her so much grief, in the end, was such a blessing to her entire nation. Where in your life have you seen your hurt become a blessing to people around you? Your greatest loss, your most lopsided defeat, the most intense pain you have experienced in your life can become something that can be a blessing to those in your life. There are so many people in this room who have seen this lived out. And I'm not going to go into the details of how this has happened in many people's lives, but please know that we have seen it happen so many times where God will not allow our pain, our loss, our discomfort, or struggles to come to nothing. He will work through them to help those around you. He might not take them away from you, but He will bring about victory for others because of your pain. And I think we all know that when He works to bless others through us, through our pain, we see how that can be a blessing to us as well. So God will work in our deepest hurts to be a blessing to others. And also in Hannah's story, what we see is that when we surrender back to God the very thing that He first gives us. This is a call that He has placed on our lives. This is an expectation that He has of us. I know this can be a struggle for many people. We work hard for the things we have, and we assume that we earned them. It was all my ingenuity. It was my work. It was my sacrifice, my smarts. It was all me, me, me. But when we get to a point where we see all that we have as first passing through the hands of God, when we surrender back to God the things that He first gave us, it is then that we are walking in obedience to Him. The way this happened for Hannah was having to surrender back to God the gift of her son Samuel. In reality, this has happened to every set of parents as their children grow and begin living life on their own. Whether or not we want to accept it as godly parents, part of our expectation is to release our children into the care of their Creator and God. When I shared earlier what I learned in that lunch discussion with my pastor friend about dealing with the stress of being a parent, I realized that I was holding on too tightly to my children. And it was a control thing. Nicole and I needed to learn to trust in God. And when our focus would then shift from doing what we can to make our children into what we want them to be, when it would shift from that to doing all that we can to bring them into their own faith relationship with Jesus Christ, we are then beginning to show and live the faith that God wants from us all. Mothers and fathers, we need to let go and trust in God. We have a job to do. We are called to train up a child in the way that he or she would go, and trust that he or she will not depart from it. We clearly have a role in witnessing and training and modeling and showing Christ in our lives to our children. But even though God has given such a wonderful blessing as our children, we are to trust in Him to bring them along. All that God gives us, everything, we are to surrender to Him. Our friendships, our marriages, our work, recreation, passions, possessions, and our children, everything that God gives us, we are to give back. And finally, Hannah's story is a story of letting go of something that we want to hold so tightly to. And when we let it go and give it to God, we see that in the end it was much more effective in His hands than in our own. The principle we see at work here is when we surrender to God what was already His, He will do a much better job with it than we ever could. Think of Hannah's son Samuel for a moment. She may have wanted Samuel to become a doctor or a lawyer or an internet star or something like that. Something else in which he would make a good living, that he would settle down with a good woman and have some good grandkids and take care of her in her old age. She would send him to the best schools, set him up with the right woman, give him advice about child rearing when he doesn't ask for it. No mothers do that. Doing all the things that we think we should do as parents. And yes, sure, that would have been a nice life, I guess. but it would not have been the life that God had for Samuel. Instead, by giving his life to God, by Hannah giving his life to God, Samuel walked much more closely with God. Samuel was given the opportunity to share God's message with the entire nation. And Samuel was there when there were two who were anointed as king. He wasn't just there, it was his hands that anointed these men as king. It was his words that were spoken over them as he was setting them up as king. Whenever we are talking about the lives and futures of our children, our possessions, our own futures, our time, our abilities, passions, or our dreams, whenever we give them to God and allow Him to work through them instead of us doing it, it will come to a greater end. They will accomplish much more in God's hands than in our own. So what are you holding on to? Is there something that God has called you to give up to Him so that He could do much more with it than you ever could? Is there something that He has given you that you need to recognize comes from His loving hands, and therefore you need to give it back to Him? Whether it was pain or pleasure, have you surrendered it back to God and His grace? Is there a deep pain or loss that you are holding on to because you think it defines you? It makes you who you are, or it's just too difficult to go back to that place and really give it to God. As we go to prayer, let us bring these things to God and finally give them back to Him and see Him do a much greater work through them. Will you please pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for the example of Hannah. Thank you for her obedience, her desire to give back to you, Lord. And God, we recognize that in her life, the amount of pain and loss that she had to deal with, Lord, you were right there through it all, working to bring about your purposes. So God, I pray that just as she was able to surrender back to you the things that you first gave her, meaning her son, Lord, help us to do the same. Help us to surrender from a place of pain, of loss, but most importantly from a place of faith. And Lord, that when we give back to you, Lord, that you would remind us that all of the things that we have in our lives first passed through your loving hands. So help us to give it to you, Lord. And God, we pray that you would help us to know when we surrender these to you. Whether it's children or futures or pain or anything else, when we surrender it, it will be much more effective and useful in your hands than if we hold on to it. So God, be glorified. To live lives in which we are completely surrendered over to your will, and that we see your purpose carried out. Amen. Will you please stand?